Hi, it's Thomas. Welcome back to Business Strategy. Today's lecture is Strategy Implementation and Strategic Control. One component of the concept of strategy implementation is organizational structure. An organization, a company, has a structure in place, and it's possible that with a new strategy, implementing that strategy successfully might require a review of or a change of organizational structure. The typical options of organizational structure are functional, which refers to the areas of the business such as marketing, finance, human resources, etc. The divisional structure could refer to either products, having our structure set up based on the different products that we offer, or by market, in other words, our customers, having divisions focusing on our different customers, or finally, geography, having divisions set up based on different geographic regions. We can also combine the functional and divisional structures into what is referred to as a matrix structure. Matrix is a combination of both functional and divisional structures. The concept of structural transition refers to changes in the general nature of our entity. When we're moving from startup to an established organization, we might have a need to change our organizational structure. What works for a startup company might not be appropriate, might not lead to continued success for a more established organization. In the case of sort of an NGO environment, looking at an entity that is funded by donors, that is not self-sustaining, to transition from being a donor-funded entity requiring regular infusions of donations to becoming a self-sustaining business such that the organization no longer requires donor funding, also is a change that might require a change in our structure, a transition to a new structure. And relating to this concept of moving from donor funding to becoming a self-sustaining business is the concept of social enterprise. Social enterprise is something between a nonprofit organization that receives donations and a traditional business which is self-funding and is focused on profit for its shareholders. A social enterprise is self-funding, but the primary goal of the organization isn't to create a return for its shareholders. A social enterprise might be funded with one-time donations. Those donors are in fact owners of the entity, but they're not necessarily looking for a return, and they might not necessarily even plan on continuing to hold their ownership. The idea behind social enterprise is set up an organization that has the capacity to fulfill a social need and is able to operate in a self-sustaining manner. So social enterprise is a relatively recent concept, and because it's not an NGO, it's also not exactly a traditional business because it has different goals and objectives. Then the structure of a social enterprise might be different because of the particular nature of social enterprise. Next is the concept of organizational enabling. What are some components of our strategy implementation and our organizational structure that will maximize the opportunity for success at the organization? Here are a few points. This is not an exhaustive list. These are concepts that are relatively new in the world of organizational structure, in the world of business. We have 4 listed here, starting with decentralization. Looking at the possibility of looking at the idea of decentralizing, not having a top-down structure in the organization, having less structure in the organization to allow for more interaction, more communication among people, more independence, as well as more interdependence among the organization, so that it's not a traditional structure of from senior management to middle management to line management to the employees. It's decentralized. Next is horizontal communication. Again, looking at the traditional structure to compare. The traditional structure is vertical communication, from the top down. Horizontal communication is the idea of communicating at the same level across the organization, among the multiple functions if we're in a functional structure, or among the multiple divisions if we're structured by division. Horizontal communication means broad communication among different groups in the organization to ensure that ideas are being shared and that the resources and the capabilities of one group, whether functional or divisional, aren't isolated, but they're shared so that the entire organization can benefit from that knowledge and those skills. Participative decision-making means that the decisions aren't just at the management or senior management level, but everyone in the organization participates in decisions, even at the line manager level and below down to the employee level. Everyone's involved in decision making. The idea is that the organization sees everyone as able to contribute, able to come up with new ideas, able to improve the organization, and so the organization allows for participation from all parties, all individuals in the entity. And then finally, cross-functional work teams. Not just individuals communicating from one function or one division to another, but actually intentionally putting together teams with members from different functions, from different divisions within the same company. Again, to make sure that good ideas and helpful capabilities are being shared throughout the organization, as well as to ensure that there's ongoing communication so that one function, one division knows what's happening in the other functions or divisions, and we prevent what's called the silo effect. The silo effect is when one segment of an organization, a function, a division, is so focused internally that they're not aware of what's going on in other areas of the business that might be important to them, that might be helpful to them. To prevent the silo effect, cross-functional work teams are an effective enabler in organizations. Next, looking at how culture relates to strategy. When we're implementing new strategy, some important points to keep in mind as they relate to culture. One, working within the existing culture, if possible, is a good idea, because changing culture is difficult. Not impossible, but it's difficult. So if at all possible, if strategy changes can be made within the existing culture, then that is ideal. Culture can change. It's not impossible to change, but it is very difficult, both because culture, the existing culture, is a very strong component of an organization. Next is the idea of working with formal and informal leaders. Formal leaders are known by their title to be leaders. They're top-level executives, they're managers in the entity, they're supervisors in the entity. Informal leaders aren't leaders based on their title, they're leaders based on their network, their influence, their ability to motivate people to do things without having a particular title, without having an official leadership position within the organization. And finally, connecting the culture with objectives. Culture tends to be a bit subjective, we could say a bit fuzzy. Objectives tend to be detail-oriented, tend to be specific. So if we can match the culture, the feel, and the ideas and the values of the organization with business objectives, specifics that we're working towards, then we're going to be in the best situation to succeed in implementing new strategy. Let's now talk about the concept of strategic control. Strategic control is... Let's now talk about the concept of strategic control. The idea of strategic control is that once we put a new strategy in place, we don't just leave it. We don't just assume that everything will be fine. We need to check and make sure that what we wanted to happen is happening. And there are two key questions that will drive our strategic control. Is the strategy being implemented as planned? Or are we doing what we planned to do? And is the implementation achieving the desired results? We wanted to do certain things, implement a certain strategy, not for the strategy in and of itself, but to achieve a certain result. And we ask these two questions. Are we implementing the strategy as we plan to do? And is that new strategy, is this implementation achieving the results that we were looking for? The tool that we use for strategic control is the four-part strategic control model. First is premise control, asking the question, are our premises still valid? In relation to external factors, we had assumptions about our external situation. We had an evaluation of our external situation prior to executing our strategy, and we need to check and see if those premises are still valid, if the external situation is still the same, if there have been any significant changes. We will need to rethink our strategy. Next is strategic surveillance. Do we see any new threats in the external environment? So the first component, premise control, is considering whether anything is changed from when we evaluated our external environment at the initial implementation of the strategy. The second component, strategic surveillance, is asking the question, is there anything new that wasn't in existence, that wasn't significant, that was not or did not have an effect on us when we initially implemented our strategy? And if there is a new threat, then again, we might need to reevaluate our strategy. Third implementation control is monitoring and measuring. The idea of seeing if we're making progress, of evaluating that progress, and determining whether our strategy is having the result that we expected it to have. And if we don't see the result we were expecting, again, we reevaluate, reconsider the strategy. And then finally, the special alert control. The special alert control is sort of an extreme scenario of strategic surveillance. When we have sudden unexpected events that are possibly significant threats to the organization, then we reevaluate. This was something that was unknown and not even expected to occur. A big surprise. In these situations, we reevaluate the strategy to determine whether it's still valid or whether we need to make a change. So we see that in evaluating strategic control, in one way or another, we're asking the question, do we need to make a change? And change, whether it relates to strategy or in a more general sense, sooner or later is going to come to an organization. And we'll talk more about managing change in our lecture on leadership. This concludes our lecture, Strategy Implementation and Strategic Control, and as always, we'll apply these concepts in class in our case study analysis, and I look forward to seeing you then.